A very good evening to everyone present here today. My name is Fulel Taha and I'm today's moderator. So I am extremely pleased to welcome you all to yet another session of the author saga. So we are now live on Facebook. So let's start by a quick introduction to Pick a Book. What Pick a Book does is that it encourages the reading habit by getting all participants to select a book, read and research on it thoroughly, and present a summary. This not only helps to hone his or her public speaking, communication, and presentation skills, but also helps to impart a wealth of knowledge. Now, currently, Pick-a-Book has marked its four countries, namely Sri Lanka, India, the UK, and Singapore, within a span of just 1 year. And as a Sri Lankan, I am so proud of the fact that this is a homegrown concept that went global. So we in Sri Lanka we have crossed the 500 plus mark, and we are in 3 regions as of now. Now, Pick a Book has begun this fantastic initiation, if you ask me. It's called the Author Saga. So, through these sessions, the authors will be able to interests. So, authors can discuss the key insights of their books, and viewers will be able to take away from this. So, these will be inspiring sessions with authors to ensure that they gain a wider reach and encourage individuals to further enhance their habit of reading. Move on to today's session. I am super excited to introduce the author for today. So today is the author is Mr. Vidusa, who is currently the destiny architect at High Five Consultancy and a training and also organization's founder and member. So he's also a TEDx speaker, and his areas of expertise lie with strategy facilitation, HR, strategy development, and leadership training. So he has conducted assignments in 7 countries regionally and consulted for the World Bank, the UN, as well as some of the top corporates in Sri Lanka and the region. So he's also a board member of Chrysalis, a social enterprise working to empower women and youth in Sri Lanka and elsewhere. So he's currently reading for his MBA while already having a MBA in leading innovation and change from the University of York St. John. So he also has a BA in business management from the University of Lincoln, UK. So with a lot of pleasure, do I welcome Mr. Vidusa to the author saga. Mr. Vidusa, welcome on board.
Thank you for having me. The
Yes,
introduction was
thank
a
you
little
so much
too big,
for taking your time.
but thank you for having me.
Well, yeah, I couldn't help it. So the audience had to know what your accomplishments are. So yeah, let's talk about your journey of becoming an author. Could you tell us a little bit about what made you become an author, Mr. Vidusa?
All right. So forgive the noise from the neighborhood. I do have a temple close by, and there's chanting going on, so you might hear that in the background. But I think it all started. I've always wanted to write. Let's put it that way. It's not something that started out because of a whiff of inspiration. But I think the first ever book I actually sat down and wrote was down to the fact that there were tons of little stories that I think was worth telling. But at the same time, what was really lacking for me was the ability to translate everyday simple life things into management principles. I've always found that management, I studied management as a subject, right? So when you're in university, you have all these theories that come up, and then you start working, and then you realize that the theories don't necessarily work out in exactly the same way at work. So 9 times out of 10, there is always this gap between what you've been taught and what you're expected to practice. And I always found that if you looked at just everyday stuff, chances are you'll be able to cull out those simple principles and make it your own far better than you would if you read a so-called management book. Right? So that's where it all started. And then, of course, one thing led to another, and before you realized it, you were penning down thoughts. I actually had written a whole heap of little bits and bobs. It never came out as a book. Took about, I think, 4 or 5 years to put all of it together and eventually come out with one book. And then one thing led to another, and here we are with 50 plus books. So it's an evolutionary process. I don't think it was
Thank you
just
so
one
much for
thing.
sharing that with us. Yeah. So so your books are co-authored by some really outstanding professionals. Could you take us through the process of co-authoring, and maybe if you could share some stories with us on how you met these amazing individuals?
Right. So I think the first co-authoring was with one of my colleagues called Anton, and I was spending a few thoughts, um, and I reached out to him and said, "Hey, you know what? I'm just putting this book down. Would you be interested?" And he was like, "Yeah, fine. Let's just do this." And I think the trick to co-authoring is two things, right? The first is you need to find people who actually understand the subject. That's critical, because none of the books we are writing are are theory based or research based. It's purely based out of our tacit knowledge, right? So they're practitioner books. They're not theoretician books. They're practitioner books. And because of that, it's essential that whoever that you're writing it with actually knows it and has done it. That's important. Okay, knowing it is one thing, being able to do something is another. There's always a disparity between the two. I'll get to that later, right? The second point is that you need to have a framework around it, which makes and facilitates that process. As long as you have these two things, a person who actually understands what needs to be done and how to do it, and a process around it, then I think the writing becomes so much easier. So I spoke to Anton, and we wrote a book in relative comfort without too much of hassle. And then we said, you know what, this sounds like a great idea. Why don't we rope in a few others? So Luminary, which I'm part of, actually has about 25 trainers. And in one of our retreats, we mooted the idea, why don't we sit down and write a book together? And that worked out pretty decently well as well. And probably one of the most craziest co-authoring partnerships took place with Fahad, right? And you know Fahad. And I had never met Fahad in my life. I've obviously hooked up with him on social media, and I was always kind of very interested in how he brands himself, you know, and how puts himself out there. I'm the complete opposite of that. I'm generally very low key and very private. But Fahad, like Anton, actually, you know, has a love of socks, which I found very amusing. He is pretty brazen in what he says out there, and he just made a comment on one of my posts on one of the books, and said, you know what, I've always wanted to write a book as well. And I wrote to him and said, you know what, I do have a thought of writing a book on personal branding. Would you be interested? And he said, yeah, you know, would love to. And I told him, you know what, how about next week? And I don't think he quite expected that, but the good-natured man he is, he turned around and said, yeah, you know, next week is a little tight, but the week after is open. I said, fine, any weekend works for me. Would you mind kind of driving up? And this is, of course, pre-COVID days, right? So you could actually travel without any restrictions or masks. So he turns up at my place in Kandy. We kind of do pleasantries and chit chat, sit down, we flesh out the concept framework. And believe it or not, before the weekend was out, we had the book. Roped in Anton as well for a couple of chapters. And we sat down and just wrote, and literally wrote a solid probably 8-10 hours at a stretch. And he left, I think, after tea or so on Sunday. And by the time he was leaving, we actually had the book done and dusted. So it helps. It really helps to have people who are like-minded coming and helping through that process.
That is indeed an amazing story, because co-authoring can be a bit difficult sometimes, and like you said, it's really important to have someone who is like-minded, uh, to share the knowledge with. So thank you so much for that amazing story, Mr. Vidusha. So I just wanted to go through some of your books, and my goodness, are these titles very straightforward, to say the least, right? So, for some of your books include No Nonsense, Cut the Crap, Jargon Free, and
Yeah.
Guru Guide, right?
Yes.
So, can you take us through a little bit on what these contains, what the book books actually talk about, and who the
Okay. So I think all the books have one thing in common, which is I think our audience are young executives, middle managers, and senior managers who are currently employed. So it's meant for people who work. Um, Probably to a lesser extent, young adults who are just entering the workplace, but by and large, the vast majority of them are aimed at people who are working currently or being employed. So the first set of books actually was called Jargon Free. And like I mentioned, I think that was an attempt to demystify management and be able to look at management principles from absolutely everyday life situations and be able to get the principles that you want out of it. Um, Cut the Crap was actually something that came out because of conversations with my daughter, right? So I have a 18-year-old daughter who goes on 19, and right throughout her childhood we would have conversations, and she would read quite a lot herself, right? And 9 times out of 10 she would actually come and have a discourse with me on the book, just like you would do with Pick a Book. Her Pick a Book audience was me, right? So she would sit down and say, hey, you know what, I read this, what do you think? And most of the time I found that traditional wisdom, with all due respect, doesn't work, because it's very highly contextual. Let me give you a quick example, right? Try again. Everyone says this, right? Never give up, and so on and so forth. Um, that's only one part of it, and we latch on to this. And I don't think it's fair, especially when you're a young adult coming into the world, to actually give you only one side of the coin. I think it's absolutely critical that you have both sides of the coin, right? So never give up is fantastic, but you need to know when to give up also. Try again, and you will succeed is true to a certain extent. But unless you know when to quit, you can spend your entire life being miserably failing at whatever you do, simply because you haven't analyzed why you're failing. And sometimes you fail not because of any fault of yours, but simply because you don't have the skill set for it, or because you don't have the specific knowledge for it, or because you're not good at it sometimes, right? It's not your fault. You can't be good at everything. You really can't. Imagine wanting to be a fantastic musician, right? But not being able to really sing to scale or play an instrument well enough, right? So if you play it as a hobby, then it's all fine. But if you really want to play at maybe a philharmonic orchestra level or to be world famous for it, you're going to fail miserably at it because you just don't have the talent for it. So Cut the Crap was really an attempt to look at everyday advice that you get, um, and look at the opposite side of it, and look at the flip side of it, right? No nonsense advice was just that. It's a There are no stories there. It's hardcore. It's one sitting reading, and it's about specific topics. So anything and everything relating to management from a practitioner's perspective will be there in no nonsense advice. So you'll have no nonsense advice for recruitment, no nonsense advice for young executives, no nonsense advice for managers, senior leaders, from entrepreneurship to almost any topic that you can think of from a management perspective will be dissected there. And the idea is that's exactly what it is. It's no nonsense advice. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. If you really want to know this, start here. So by the way, it's not an in-depth study either. By the way, it is meant to be a starter's guide. If you know nothing about it, pick up the book and you'll be able to get something out of it. Guru Guide, well, that started out because during COVID, we were all stuck at home still, right? And we got bored, and we started talking to really interesting people on different topics, and we realized that some of them truly have a wealth of knowledge inside them that never necessarily comes out. They're not necessarily popular people, but they're very, very good at what they do. So Guru Guide was our attempt to showcase some of the work they do, and to give something to the reader that you probably wouldn't read anywhere else. So these are distilled pieces of knowledge, little nuggets that comes out from them. So those are the four little titles that you spoke about, a little
Or
bit about.
I mean, I really like the fact that you are trying to complicate the management principles. I mean, from the books I have read so far, I mean, I guess that's why a lot of youngsters do not like to read. It's so complicated, you know. These principles, they're so long, they're so broad, and they talk about, you know, all this. It's a lot to take in. So I guess this would be a quick read for anyone, I guess, who is trying to practice the management principles. And yeah, so I was particularly intrigued by this one book about you talk about how when someone gets a leadership position assigned to them, so they were working as a normal person and a normal in a team, and then they were assigned these leadership positions. So does this explain about the do's and don'ts of someone who was newly assigned a leadership position?
Yeah, so much of the No Nonsense series is exactly that, just do's and don'ts, and little pointers. Just a word of caution there, right? I know management books can be laborious to read. I suffered through them during my studies. I must admit, though, it is important that you do read those chunky texts also. I think a little knowledge is a very dangerous thing. So, the books we've co-authored are great starters. As I said, it's for practitioners, and it's to whet your appetite about a particular subject. And if you really want to get some insights about some of the problems you face, maybe you find some solutions there. However, I do think if you're at work and if you're in a day job and in a corporate setting, I do think it's worthwhile to suffer through those books, even though they might not be pleasant reading. So there are two variable aspects of it, right? The first is, of course, books like the more populist books, like Jim Collins and Good to Great and Waterman and Tom Peters with In Search of Excellence and all of those ranges of books. Those are pleasant reads because there's stories, there is a principle, there is a application aspect of it, all of it being covered. But I do think it's worthwhile to dive into some of those really chunky, hardcore textbooks as well. Because if you study them hard enough, you'll realize that you see patterns when you're working, and you'll be able to connect the dots a lot better. So my advice is, I know it's painful, but do spend some time on those books as well because they can be really, really good reads.
Uh, Thank you for the amazing advice, Mr. Vidusha. Also, you also talked about your daughter being there for most of, she used to come and ask you on what you thought of this. So I realized that your daughter was also a co-author on some of your books. So what's it like having a co-author in within the family?
it's not different to anybody else co-authoring. I must admit the reason why she first came and wrote a book with me was because I think she very passionately believes in certain elements and what she went through as a kid. She's very introverted, um, and I think introverts in a way view the world very differently, right? And one of the things I think she grappled with is being completely comfortable in seeing her being completely comfortable with who she is rather than trying to fit a mold, and that's difficult growing up. um, so I think when we started writing, she came and said, look, I have this idea. I think you should write about being comfortable in your own skin, because lots of the conversations at home revolved around those areas, right? So for example, why would you want to necessarily socialize? Is it not okay to be completely okay with being just reading a book at home rather than going partying, or um, taking part in activities and going for sports and things like that I would be very comfortable with. And she was a polar opposite of that. Not to say she didn't do stuff in school. Of course she did. She was into drama. She was into debating and speaking and all sorts of things. But she's very reserved, and she is very much more introverted than me. And one of the conversations that we would have all the time was about how you need to be okay with that. It's perfectly all right to be yourself. And she said, look, why don't you write about that? So I said, I don't know how to relate to that because that wasn't me. Why don't you write it? And she said, look, okay, in that case, can we write it together? And that's how it started. So we grabbed a cup of coffee one day and said, all right, here we go, let's flesh it out. We came up with a small framework for it as always, and sat down and wrote it, and it worked quite nicely. And that kind of stuck. So whenever she kind of comes up with topics of interest for her, I rope her in and write, and now she kind of does her own thing and writes by herself. So I don't think it was any different. My daughter and I kind of have a pretty close relationship, and we draw lines when it comes to work, and normal stuff, right? So in that sense, it was easy. It wasn't too hard. I don't know what it was like for her, but for me, it was perfectly normal.
All right. So, I mean, being comfortable in your own skin, I think it's a great topic to talk about, and we will definitely check it out. So, I just have one more question. So, before this program began, I had a chat with you and asked you why exactly, do you publish your books out for free? Because that
Yeah.
and I
Yeah.
think I genuinely believe that the audience deserve to know your reason behind it, as to why you put it out there for free of charge.
Okay, it's a very personal thing. I must admit, with respect, I think I think there's wisdom in saying that things that come free is undervalued, and it's true for the most part. Okay, and I do think that authors do need to charge for what they do, simply because it takes a chunk of time to put something together. It is your tacit knowledge. So I'm deeply respectful of the fact that not all books can be given free. Having said that, um, I need to kind of go back in time, right? So, my dad is a product of free education. He was the first of his family to come out to Colombo, go to university, get himself a higher education. And it was a big deal at home to be educated, and growing up, it was one of those things that was always drummed into me to say, you need to educate yourself, not necessarily qualify yourself, but it was considered very important to be educated. And my dad is a socialist. I disagree with him on this point, by the way. I completely disagree with him on this point. But my dad is a socialist, and he's genuinely of the belief that education must be free for everybody. Okay, and he was with the university service for 37 long years. And whenever I do my training programs, my dad always comes and tells me, I think you're wrong in doing this. You're charging a lot of money to train people, and it's your tacit knowledge. Knowledge should be given free for anyone to use because it's for the betterment of a human being. So why would you want to charge for it? And does that mean that your knowledge is only for the rich? This is always a conversation that happens. So I told my dad, look, I have a vocation. I'm a trainer by vocation. I can't do this for free. I must make a living, right?
Yeah.
So I told him, look, I have no way of doing it. And when I started writing, he did tell me, you know what? Maybe you shouldn't charge for certain things. And this kind of worked on my mind, and I have a lot of respect for my dad, and I love him dearly. So the free book idea came out of him, actually. It wasn't mine. I'm an unashamed capitalist, right? I believe in the capitalist system. I think there should be demand and supply. Uh, but the first book actually came out free, and then more and more digital platforms were available. More and more, you didn't have to necessarily spend any money printing the book, right? Physically. And because of that, I think an e-book being given for free made perfect sense. And then when we started writing a lot more, we stuck to it and said, look, let this be our way of giving back. If anybody wants to benefit from our tacit knowledge, they can, because if they actually pick up the book and read, they will realize the fact that this is not fluff. This is actual tacit knowledge being translated into written form and compressed into a booklet that you can read in one sitting. And we thought, why not? So the first couple of books came out free, and then it became one of those things that you did habitually. And we decided at that point, let's make sure that whatever we write is for free. So all of our books and all of our small little booklets and such are all free and can be downloaded without you even registering your name. There's no catch to it. You just have to go to the site, click a button, and it downloads. That's it.
I have done it myself. It so givers gain, they say, right? So yeah, that's a very interesting answer to that. Thank you for that. So basically, we I just wanted to leave with this question. So pick a book team, and even for aspiring authors who are watching this session today, what advice do you have for them? And a common, yeah, also to add to that, a common problem is writer's fog. Is there any way that we can overcome that?
Okay. So I must admit, I wouldn't know how to write a novel. Okay.
Okay. Very
So it's very difficult for me to visualize that. You'll have to ask my daughter that question, because she's actually trying to write fiction. So I can't answer that from a fiction perspective. I'll answer it from a non-fiction perspective, right? I think my advice to people who would start writing is, first and foremost, like Nike would say, just do it. There's no way out of this. You have to sit down quietly and just start writing. But here are a couple of tips that would help you, especially with when you get, the writer's block and you don't necessarily know how to compartmentalize it. So number one, first and foremost, in 5 sentences, write what your book is about before you start. In 5 sentences. If you can't write in 5 sentences what your book is about, that means you haven't distilled your ideas. Your ideas are all over the place. Okay, so that's number one. Start with the end in mind, always, with life in general or with writing a book. Write with the end in mind. So you need to be able to encapsulate your distilled idea in 5 sentences. If you can't do that, then that means you don't have the idea distilled enough for you to write a book. Secondly, actually start breaking down what you want to focus on. If you write an essay, you'll have paragraphs, right? And if you write a book, you'll have chapters. So break it up. The third is to make sure that you are able to decide whether you want what type of book you write, and the length of it depends on that. So if you want a one sitting read like what we do, it's generally 50 to 60 pages, nothing more. Anything more than that, people are not going to read. But if you want something a little bit more elaborative, 120 to 150 pages is a good enough length to look at. And then, of course, if you want something far more detailed, then of course you can run into, hundreds and hundreds of pages. But here's the trick. You need to be able to home in on one thing at a time. That is where lots of people fail, because you're trying to say too many things in one chapter. So decide on a chapter and make sure that the chapter is about just one thing. The other thing that really works for me, honestly, is to be able to break away from all the distractions. When you sit down quietly and when you start putting the framework in your mind and when you start writing, if you stop the flow, it's very difficult to pick it up and write again. So what I generally do is, my general go-to place is Gaul. I love Gaul, and I love the Gaul fort. And I have a friend out there, so he has a little room that is available for me whenever I bounce out there. I park myself there on a Friday night. I get up, have breakfast on Saturday morning, grab a cup of coffee or tea, sit down, and I start writing. And I generally put my phone on silent or I switch it off completely. And I keep writing. And you will realize that you can get a lot done if you have a weekend for yourself with absolutely zero distractions. So if your family is okay with you being all alone by yourself, my advice to you will be park yourself out somewhere that nobody will disturb you, switch off your phone, and once you start writing, don't get up until you finished. So if you're writing a practitioner's book like I would, then I think 2 to 3 days is plenty time to get the fleshing out of it done. Once you have done that, then you can start tinkering with it, and you will edit it and tinker with it and perfect it and then eventually put it out. But the chunk of it, if you can get it out of the way between 2 to 3 days, I think you've made it. Otherwise, you'll be writing it forever.
All right. So just to recap what you just told, so the first step would be to write 5 sentences about the book with an end in mind, and then you divide what you want to write about into chapters and component, and then you start, find a distraction-free environment and just do it.
And don't get up until you've done it.
Okay,
Otherwise, you'll be coming back to it all the time, and you'll be starting all over again. Because once you've lost that train of thought, it's very difficult to get back to it. That's actually the trick. So if you have something like a long weekend, and Sri Lanka is famous for long weekends, right? You might as well park yourself somewhere, go someplace quiet, and go someplace that nobody knows you're there, and sit down there and start writing. And if you have about 4 or 5 days, block that time out. If you finish early, that's great. If not, you still have a little bit more time that you can finish it off. So as much as you finish a book in one sitting, try and write in one sitting also. In one sitting doesn't necessarily mean a day, but in one sitting, so that you finish it once and for all. Otherwise, it actually is very, very difficult. At least for me.
All right. This was actually a very inspiring conversation, and I'm surely going to read these books, especially for someone who likes not overcomplicating things, right? So, and I know our viewers will want to as well. So we have Mas saying, nice to see Vidusha collaborating with Pick a Book. Thank you, Mas, for that comment. So we are basically living in a time where books are so expensive. So you can go to visit the website v.com and get your booksbyv.com and download your free PDF copy. So with that, we have come to the end of our author saga session, which is a part of Pick a Book. Once again, Pick a Book encourages the reading habit by getting to read a book, research on it thoroughly, and present a summary. By doing this, Pick a Book not only helps to hone his or her public speaking skills, communication, and presentation skills, but also helps to impart a wealth of knowledge. If you want to be a part of the Pick a Book community, or if you would like to see Pick a Book in your region and join the journey of inspiring people, please reach out to us via the email present on the screen, and we are all eagerly looking forward to hearing from you. My name is Fulel Taha. I was the moderator this evening, and thank you so much, Mr. Vidusa, for sharing your amazing story and valuable insights. It was truly a brilliant session. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We'll see you soon.
Thank you so much. Have a great evening.